Welcome back. So I hope you had a good lunch break. I had my turkey sandwich with my baked lays. I hope you didn't hear me chewing on them. So we're going to start off our afternoon sessions. We have 3 sessions at 1, 2, and 3. And our first session is about to begin with Dr. Jennifer Morrison and Jacina Guess. And Angel Rucker, one of our LES scholars, is going to do the introductions. Angel? You're muted. There you go.
Okay. Welcome to our 1 o'clock panel. This session will feature Ms. Jacina Guess and Dr. Jennifer Morrison presenting Blooming in the Whirlwind, a conversation between Dr. Jennifer Morrison and Jacina Guess. Jacina Guess is the assistant editor for The Bitter Southerner. Her writing explores the intersection of land, family, race, violence, and gender. She was born in rural Alabama, raised in Washington, D.C. She lived in Philadelphia and the Midwest before putting down roots in rural Northeast Georgia. Dr. Jennifer Morrison is a visiting instructor at the University of Louisiana. She received her PhD from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette in 2020. Her dissertation, Long Revision, Contemporary African-American Fiction of the Gulf South, examines narratives surrounding Black subjectivity in an area vulnerable to economic and ecological instability.
Welcome, Jacina and Dr. Morrison. Y'all there?
Hi. Thanks for the introduction, Angel.
Hey.
Hi, Matthew. Nice to meet you. Hi, Jennifer. Nice to meet you.
Hey, good to meet you.
Yeah. So.
All right. I guess we'll start.
You started?
Yeah, y'all go and get started.
Okay. Jennifer, should I get started with why I thought we should name this Blooming in the Whirlwind?
Absolutely. I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
Well, because we haven't met. We just met over the phone. Matthew asked us both to be on this panel and we talked on the phone a little bit. And then Jennifer texted me and she's like, there's a hurricane coming. I'm about to lose power and all this stuff. And it made me think of this Gwendolyn Brooks poem that I actually can't say that I fully understand the whole poem. It's called The Second Sermon on the Warpland, but I'm just gonna read the last line of it. In the wild weed, she is a citizen and is a moment of highest quality, admirable. It is lonesome, yes, for we are the last of the loud. Nevertheless, live, conduct your blooming in the noise and whip of the whirlwind. And so I just thought, let's conduct our blooming right here on this little panel and take care of ourselves and figure out how we're going to untangle some whiteness in half an hour.
Yeah.
So let's get to it.
Hey.
So.
I'm actually coming to you all from my office because I have no power at home. I mean, no, not any power. I have no internet. So I feel that those last lines are really relevant to me because I'm just trying to piece together, having classes and doing this panel and just keeping everything together without having everything I need. So I really felt those last few lines. Yeah, today. But I guess I'd start off with asking you, Jacina, what kind of work that you guys do at the Bitter Southerner? I've read it several times and I find it so interesting. And I wanted to know if you could kind of talk about that with me before we get started talking about our particular topic.
Sure, yeah, I'm the managing editor now, and but basically we publish a couple stories a week trying to expand the narrative of the South and kind of ask people to think critically about nostalgia and about Southern identity, and because you really can't talk about the South without talking about the legacy of slavery and racism, but also there's beautiful things about the South, and so working with both that when you love a place and love something, what does it mean also when there's pain in there, and we're working on balancing those and telling stories and kind of amplifying and expanding the narrative about Southernness. So that's kind of in a nutshell, just sifting through pitches and editing and working with writers and stuff. So yeah, And Jennifer, do you want to share a little bit more about your work? Just, I mean, you're introduced.
Yeah, I guess, to kind of even piggyback on what you were talking about, my work focuses on, so the theorist Thaddeus Davis, she talks about Southscapes, and there's multiple different types of Souths, right? And so what I write about is the Gulf South, which is where I live right now in Lafayette, Louisiana, and about how this particular space is unique and different, and how, we have this master narrative about the Southern experience and then also the Southern Black experience, but there are many different experiences in the South. And I think a lot of my work focuses on like small movements and small moments of Black subjectivity and migration. We have this narrative in literary studies and probably cultural studies of what the Black experience is. And when we discuss rural subjects, a lot of times we're talking about white people and at least contemporary rural subjects. And when we talk about Black people, we're talking about urban areas. But my work, I'm interested in thinking about what the contemporary rural Black experience is, partially because I kind of live it, but also partially because I come to this work and my PhD with an interest in that experience. When I was very young, a teacher put in my hand an Ernest Gaines novel, and I worked at the Ernest Gaines Center as a graduate assistant, and I was passionately devoted to his work because I recognized a lot of truth in it and a lot of my experiences. And so my work, I started to look at what is the contemporary African-American rural experience. And my dissertation covers work of Attica Locke. She's a mystery novelist, Jesmyn Ward, and Kiese Layman. So I look for narratives that kind of talk about what does it mean to be Black, Southern, and rural right now in this moment.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm so glad Matthew put us together because it's really fascinating. My parents lived in, I was born in rural Alabama just because my dad had worked for the Federation for Southern Black Farmers Cooperative in Epps, Alabama, which was, you may already be familiar with their work, but they do a lot about advocacy and land rights and working with, the fact that Black farmers used to be a huge part of the Southern landscape and were sort of intentionally, economically, and socially terrorized and pushed out. And so, he was part of that movement of, wanting to enhance the lives of rural Black people, especially I think so much about our relationship to the land. I don't know if you've read that book, Farming While Black, by Leah Penniman, but just talking about how the land was the source, was the site of the trauma, but not the source of the trauma, and just the ways that we can we kind of kick ourselves in the foot by avoiding natural spaces. I mean, and I shouldn't say kick ourselves in the foot because there's real trauma attached to it, but I just think that when I compare the times I've lived in Philly or DC and the times I've lived in rural spaces, I've felt so renewed and rejuvenated. And I think that we can reclaim those rural spaces, but there's still challenges. So yeah, I'm excited to talk more about that. And I think I'll mention too that my father's Black and my mother's white. And so I was joking with Jennifer that I'm capital M mixed, right? And one of the things we were talking about was this whole thing about performative Blackness and women, especially lately in the media, getting attention for pretending to be Black, and I know that in my experience of being mixed, I know that walking around in my skin and in my life experience is different than if I had both my parents being Black, you know what I mean? But I know that different people claim and discuss that different ways, but I just want to, let's be upfront about the untangling within my own narrative and within the larger, there's just these assumptions that we want to say, this is what Black is.
Right.
This is what white is. And even just the ways in which that one drop rule is changing societally and socially. So anyway, where should we begin? What do you want to talk about, Jen?
Well, we could piggyback off of that. But I kind of definitely wanted to talk about with you, because we talked a little bit about it before when we discussed what this summer of reckoning with all like Black Lives Matter and everything. And it was an incredible moment because for so long you saw Black Lives Matter being posited as this like bad movement, terrorist, whatever. And then I saw all of these corporations, companies, and people that I knew come together in support and solidarity. And you know, I want to know what you think in this moment. What do you think about that? Do you think that this is sustaining? Or, you know, I hope you're not like me and not cynical a little bit about it.
I'm very cynical, actually.
Yeah.
As soon as corporations grab onto anything, it's suspect, you know? And so, woo, should we talk about Ice Cube?
Oh, God.
You know, it's just like the ways that
right?
capitalism can really destroy us, right? And I think as soon as it becomes a marketing strategy to latch on to a movement, but at the same time, if a platform is given and a door is open, then walk on through that door and see what we can do with it. I just, it is just so hard. I just find it really challenging to like untangle, you know, because of course, our whole economy was based on a system which was based in racism. And so like, how do we separate the economic and, you know, social things? Yet, I also think, I don't know, did you watch the Jane Goodall movie? This is kind of an aside, but
no.
I just watched it and I was like, oh, it made me feel really good because she talked about like, you know, she worked with oil executives. And I think I can kind of make a bridge with this, but just the fact that like, she was working with oil executives to try to make preserves for chimpanzees. And a lot of people are like, why would she even talk to them? Because they are part of the problem. And I think there's a way in which like everyone has power. And so if we can all think about how we leverage that power towards good, then, you know, corporations are part of that, right? So like I think that's where I think watching that kind of helped temper my cynicism a little bit to think, how can we see this expanded conversation? How do we not lose momentum, I guess, about this? And so, so what do you think about it?
Well, I'm part of my cynicism comes from are involved in somewhat academia, and I see so many. I saw a lot of movement coming immediately this summer out of people, you know, starting up diversity departments and, you know, wanting to hire in African American lit and you know, African American studies, and it's very encouraging. But what I worry about, and I guess that piggybacks off to what you said about like this performance of Blackness, and I worry about that is, you know, when the weight is on one person in a system or in an institution to do that work, you're set up to fail. And, you know, to piggyback off of people performing Blackness for whatever reason they want to do that in certain institutions, and because it's not just one, you know, there's a level of taking advantages of some of the absurdities we have around the conversations of what race is, and leveraging it for personal gain, you know, being opportunistic. And I don't know, have you read The Fire Next Time by
James
and then so that text, and then The Fire This Time by Jesmyn Ward, like she had this collected essays.
I haven't read it yet.
Oh, it's so good. But she has this one essay in it, it's by Kevin Young, and he basically talks about the absurdities of like our rules around race in America. And the essay, you know, it came out, I think the text came out in like 2018, but his essay was based around the first instance that we had of this, which was Rachel Dolezal, and also the summer of like Charleston and the Confederate flag and all the controversies around that, and then the massacre in Charleston. And so basically what he talked about was like, there's so many rules about what it means to be Black or raced in our society that it's almost absurd. And so you're gonna get people like Rachel Dolezal who exploit that, right? I kept thinking about that particular professor out of GW,
Right.
who, was found out not to be Black, I guess. And,
Mhm.
she sort of, it was a sophisticated way of moving through race because people sort of came out and said, well, you're sort of not allowed to ask people what their background is. And I was like,
Mhm.
yeah, I don't want to live in a world where I ask you to produce your 23andMe and
Mhm.
and say what race you are. I don't like that. But
Mhm.
then it sort of allows people to perform Blackness. And so I guess part of this untangling of whiteness, we're trying to figure out what whiteness is. Um, how do we figure out what Blackness is? What is that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
And all of
Mhm.
the rules that are associated with it are absurd. And you mentioned the one drop rule.
Mhm.
Well, what if you find out you're like a 1% technically Black? Are you
Mhm.
allowed to perform that Blackness? Well, obviously no, culturally,
Mhm.
but that speaks to the sort of the absurdities of race we have in this country. And
Yeah.
then when you have a structure that insists that one or two people represent for a race of people, you are going to get people exploiting these absurdities. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I guess that's why I'm sort of cynical
Yeah.
about this moment.
Mhm.
And part of the reckoning, I was so excited to see people having conversations that they hadn't had before, both interpersonally and online, because we were all supposed to be separated in the
Right.
pandemic. So we were supposed to be doing it. So I saw all kinds of
Mhm.
things online that I'd never seen before.
Mhm.
I am a person who follows fashion blogs like religiously and different influencers religiously. And to see random influencers out of France saying, Black Lives Matter, I stand with you. I'm like, what world am I in? And then you see, like, to what you were saying, corporations, gushers sharing a Black Lives Matter message. I don't even know what that means. So it gets to be parody. But I guess that some of my cynicism comes out of, okay, what is substantive and what is concrete that we can get out of this moment? And
Mhm.
I don't know, I'm not quite sure what that is outside of maybe a few individuals making out well. How do we do that as a collective, right?
Mhm. Well, and I think what I hope is that people would actually like read and engage history, right? Because this moment, I mean,
Yeah.
even Rachel Dolezal, all of like it's actually not new, right? But
Right.
there's these conversations that loop around of,
Mhm.
police brutality,
Yes.
incarceration. None of these things are new, right? But and so I think that's what's hard is when there's the sense of urgency around it
Yes,
can make
yes.
people think this is a new conversation. And it's like,
Mhm.
I really want people to go deep, like into their own family history, into their own like geographical history, and into like the history of how we think about race. Like even when you mention like this influencer in France, I read this book a few years ago. I don't know if you've read it, called The Last Black Count, but it's about Alexander Dumas' dad. He wrote
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the Three Musketeers and stuff. And it's funny because my grandmother, she collected books and she was always like, Alexander Dumas was Black. And I'm like, yes, Nana. But she, and Matthew, he and I had talked separately about it. She was like, and Frank Yerby is Black. And I'm like, yes, Nana. Like, anyway, so, but the, but he, there was, like in France before the revolution, I'm not a French historian, so I might mess this up. But the point is, there was a Black count who was a general in France in like the late 1700s. And that was Alexander Dumas' father. And, like racism really took hold
Mhm.
at the same time as nation building, right?
Right,
And so it's
right.
like these words about citizenship, like Claudia Rankine's Citizen, like I think everyone needs to read
Mhm.
that book and really like sit with it a lot and think about what she's still doing there, because I think I just wonder what it would mean, like, and even if we want to be American, right? Like,
Yeah.
because that's an interesting question, because I don't even know whether because clearly like when people have said American for so long, that has been exclusionary of people of
Mhm.
African descent, even, going back to like the 3/5 law and all with, and everything. So I just think like and that's where it's like, I even wonder, cause like, the resistance to wanting to pledge allegiance. It's like, pledge allegiance to
Right,
what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to belong to
right.
the country? And so like, it's like on the one hand, we're like wanting to participate in this democracy and want to move forward and believe we can be part of it. And at the same time, when you've been sort of systematically written into this separate cast, it's like, I don't even know where I'm going with this, because it's it's like all these layers of stuff,
Yeah,
right?
it is.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when I'm teaching, like I'll teach a text, like something in African American Lit, and I'll have to explain to students sometimes, okay, so I teach at the University of Louisiana Lafayette, and our student population, we have probably about, I don't want to guess too much, but like 20 to 30% African American students. And then all of our students usually come from Louisiana, the surrounding areas, and they are of different backgrounds, but the university's mascot is the Raging Cajuns, which, and so the Cajuns comes from our cultural French Canadian background, right? And so the Cajuns resettled from Nova Scotia. They came down to the United States, to Louisiana, and settled in this area. And so a part of encouraging cultural pride, something that started in the 70s with the French-speaking reclaiming of cultural heritage in this area. So the university changed their mascot from the Bulldogs to the Cajuns. And I did not know this. So growing up, I was like, okay, Cajuns, got it, whatever. And my mom came here in the early 70s, and she said the mascot wasn't always the Bulldogs. It was, always the Raging Cajuns, it was the Bulldogs. And they changed it after they left. And she said, we protested it because we didn't want that. We felt it was racist. And I was like, why? And she said, that we felt it didn't represent all of the students here. And so, it made me rethink the narrative I had been taught or associated with the university, in that, oh, this was a moment of reclaiming cultural pride for people who spoke French and were French descended, because they had to move away from that identity and that culture, because during the 50s and the 40s and the 30s, there were movements to stop people from speaking French in schools and acknowledging that heritage. And they were reclaiming that as a part of, during the 70s. But the way my mom structured the story, she basically was saying this was also a reaction to integration in some ways, because so she's like, it could be both, but there's these competing narratives. And so one of the things that I think is true, unfortunately, in this country, is that African Americans have one narrative about what's going on, and generally white America has this other narrative, and they may not, it's not necessarily false, but they're competing and they're going against each other. And that is part of a part of contention. And so what happens is sometimes I'll be teaching a text and it will be in African American literature, and even Black students will say, well, I didn't know that happened. I didn't know this went down. I didn't realize this. And then they'll say, my grandfather or my grandparents said this or had these experiences. And it's like, oh, I recognize this in the text. And then you'll have like students who are white who will notice and say, well, I'm from here. So mind you, the text will be in the South. And they're like, well, we may be Southerners, but, we're from Louisiana. We're separate from that, because our people didn't own slaves and Cajuns were like this. And it's like, well, here's an Ernest Gaines book, well, here's another text that speaks to this. But, there's a sort of like a remove from these histories. And one of the things that struck me about Citizen was she has this line where she talks about, and I'm not quoting it directly because I don't have it in front of me, but it struck me. She talked about like my historical self and your historical self are meeting. And it's not just us as individuals, but as our past, and our parents' past and our grandparents' past and all of that stuff are meeting together in this moment. And that is charged and loaded. And, when I'm teaching students, and these are like 18 to 25 years generally, sometimes I'll have older students, but they are grappling maybe for the first time with the weight of those words and those ideas. Like, oh, I have a historical self and a past, and I bring that to interactions that are current. And that may be why, for example, my students tell me, Trayvon Martin was when I realized they won't say radicalized, but when I understood that the country was uneven, or Colin Kaepernick's protest was, and I realized I'm looking at my classmate, they're looking, they're white or whatever, and they're looking at me and I'm Black, and we do not agree, and I don't understand why. And it's, those historical selves are meeting. I'm thinking about what my parents say about race, or what my grandparents have said about race and their experiences, and they're coming up against, what their grandparents and what their parents are saying about race. And I think it was epitomized when the whole controversy with Drew Brees over the summer. I don't know if you follow the Saints. You're probably a Falcons fan. We can forgive that. But, he's the quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. And he did an interview, and he said, I'm going to stand for the flag because when I look at that flag, I think about my grandparents or my grandfather serving during World War II and fighting for this country. And then his whole, half the team who happens to be African-American were like, what's that supposed to mean? We don't have grandparents that served in the military. What is that? And so
yeah.
He had to apologize for it. And, people were upset with him for apologizing. He said, no, you stand behind what you said. But I was like, you are on a team with all these African-American men, you fight, together and every Sunday, and you're bonded in that way. And yet you just completely made this, mistake of understanding their own citizenship and processing, the American flag. My grandfathers were both in the military. My grandfather went to Korea, and he returned home to, his daughter going to segregated schools. How do you not know this? How are you ignorant of our history? We shared it together. So I think part of the frustration is that we must be accountable for our historical selves, if that makes sense. And in the conversations that I was seeing after, George Floyd, I was also seeing it narratized in that moment as something that's coming out of George Floyd. But I was like, Ahmaud Arbery had happened like 2 weeks before. And Breonna Taylor was happening, that whole thing. And, then that woman in the park who like lied on that man, with the bird feeding incident. I was like, it was a culmination of frustration with the way that Black people had to move through space, with law enforcement, with racism, that moment just jettisoned and became this big thing. It became a powder keg. And I also think, to speak to that, in my work, I'm intrigued at the ways that we erase contemporary African-American rural experiences, like Southern Black folk. And I was like, Breonna Taylor, that's a Southern woman, a Southern Black woman. And Ahmaud Arbery, that's a Southern Black man. And yet the face of it was George Floyd, right? Who is this, urban, and, he also spent time in the South. I make notes of these things, but, we code these things as urban and outside of certain spaces geographically when it's happening all over. And so, part of the reckoning has got to be, we have to realize that it's not a liberal conspiracy that everybody's talking about this. It's because even in my little town of Lafayette, we've had an incident where people are protested, even, wherever you are, there are these tensions, there are these realities. And so we share, because of the systemic way in which racism has affected us historically and continues to do so, everyone is experiencing these things. And so how part of the reckoning has got to be, it's all over, it's everywhere. Yeah.
And also I think what you were saying too about like really claiming responsibility for the work of it. I mean, I a while ago you're talking about this, all these like diversity and equity and inclusion groups and people that are sort of like getting amplified or getting like job promotions because of this. But the fact is, like, it is hard and exhausting work emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. And I think like people need to do that work. I'm so tired of folks being like, thank you. I'm like, don't thank me, join me, because that's really where it needs to happen. And I know folks are at different places on a spectrum. And I think I was just thinking about sort of one thing to like untangle with whiteness would be this sort of sense of paralysis, like, hey, teach me, hey, I need you. And I'm like, no, you've needed us to like build your economy. You've needed us to like nurse your babies. You've needed us to like cook your food. You don't need us. Like, let us be whole. Let us be as smart and brilliant. And actually, like, let us be an authority over you. Like, sure, we can teach you if that's, Jennifer's job to be the teacher. And that's an awesome job to have. But therefore then like your students need to be willing to be taught. And I know that there's, you know, I think one thing in terms of like a hope moving forward would be for folks to be open to being taught and having someone who is like an authority over them who is not white, you know, and so I think that's a real challenge, and I think it's part of why we even have the president we have, was because of the resistance to accepting Black leadership at a national level. I know Matthew just put in a little thing that we should ask people if they have questions. Let's go for 3 more minutes, right at one. We'll switch, because I did want to just say one thing about the military, because like I often struggle when people bring up, you know, World War II and what your grandfather did, and like my grandfather, you know, had been trained in Ohio and actually left rural Ohio to move to DC because he'd been offered a job at the Naval Observatory to create these lenses. You know, he had a specialized trade and he had the skills and he showed up with the job.
Right.
But they weren't expecting a Black man to have that knowledge.
Yeah.
And the job was not there for them. He had already been displaced, you know, from Ohio to DC, and then was like, I don't have a job, you know. So I mean, he'd ended up then moving to Baltimore and working, you know, on the airplanes for the military. But it was a bitter pill, you know what I mean? And he ended up, you know, really becoming a peace activist after World War II, and joined the Quakers, and kind of like really was not your average, like your idea of like, you know, that military experience made him very anti-military because his authority was not respected. And I think we carry that in our sense of identity and our sense of belonging in this country.
Right.
Anyway, I do want people who are out there to know that we would love to know what questions you have. Jennifer and I can just keep talking, like this is really interesting. Or Matthew, if you have a question, but
while Jennifer was talking, and while you were talking, I just kept writing down stuff because there's so much to unpack with everything that you said. And there's only just 2 things I want to say, or just kind of add. Thank you, definitely, both of you, and especially for the historical self and the self-self. I mean, that's a very important thing that I always go back to with Claudia Rankine's book. And I forgot exactly which vignette or which story that's with, or which incident that's with, but that whole thing of unpacking that self and what that self is. I always tell my students that, can we ever get to our true self, whatever the heck that is?
Yeah. Well, I think, I didn't want to, you know,
go ahead.
That, but I think I was thinking about, because this is the Lillian E. Smith Center's Symposium, and I returned to the text Killers of the Dream, and I was looking through it. I'd read it years ago, but one of the things that I always come away with when I engage that text is how brutally honest it is. Brutally honest. And I was like, it's going to require people to have that level of honesty for us to do the work we need to do with regards to this reckoning, like that level of honesty. And I'm not sure that people are going to be able to be that honest, because Josina, you were talking about, it's going to require people to sort of understand their historical selves and be accountable for that. It's going to require people to be honest about what those historical selves are. And I'm not sure that people are ready to be honest about what their families are like, or what they think, or what they've done, and how that relates to a contemporary sense of self. I'm not sure that people are going to do that, because I think a lot of the performance of whiteness is this idea of like, oh, I just came into the world, tabula rasa, like, you know, I don't have anything to do with all this. And you're the one that's loaded, and you're the one tainting it with all of your baggage and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I've had many conversations with students who will come out and, for example, there was this text we were reading, Teacher Geronimo Johnson. It's in the text, the character walks into his attic. He's a young white guy from Georgia.
Welcome
to Braggsville. And he walks into his attic, and he sees that his family has all this racist memorabilia, you know, the Aunt Jemima, you know, cookie jars and all that stuff. And he's like, I did not know we owned this. And, you know, a couple of my students were like, I've seen that before. And I'm like, you know, and so some of the things that we kind of have to talk about is like, what is your relation to these topics? How close is this to you? Those are going to be hard conversations to have. And I'm not sure that people are ready or willing to do that level of work. I don't know.
And I think you see that in Lillian Smith. I mean, she talks about how hard it was for her to write Killers of the Dream. for one, diving into herself. But one thing that always sticks out to me, and it's kind of a funny story, you know, and hits at what you're saying, Jennifer, is that her secretary was like, please, God, do not write another book like this. So her secretary who typed everything out, and I think her secretary was Betty Clifton, who actually, her husband was at Georgia Tech, I think, and they helped to get the journal published because there was issues with the mail up in Clayton. But that's another story. But she was actually like, please write a cookbook next instead of that. And she actually started writing a cookbook, which is kind of interesting to me. But I would really suggest if people haven't read Welcome to Braggsville, really good book. T. Geronimo Johnston won the Ernest Gaines literary. Didn't he win the award?
He did.
He did, yeah. But it's set basically, it's a white student from Georgia who goes to Berkeley, meets with a black student, Asian American student, and I forgot who else. I think a Native American student or somebody or a woman who claims Native American identity, a girl. And they come back to a Civil War reenactment in Georgia, basically. So it's this really interesting kind of novel told through the white student's point of view. But there's a couple of questions here. And when you were talking about the military, I kept thinking about Frank Yerby too, and his military service and everything like that. But there are a couple of questions. One from actually a teacher here at Piedmont who teaches Citizen. And I think he's probably going to start using Just Us too, that just came out. But he asked, maybe we just answer this. How do you think we attain such meetings with the historical and the self-self? How do you think we attain such meetings in or outside of the classroom with whiteness is a refusal, when whiteness is a refusal of the historical self, when whiteness is a grotesquely narcissistic fantasy? And Smith talks about that narcissism. I think you were kind of answering that a little bit, Jennifer, but just seeing her, Jennifer, if y'all want to add to it.
Yeah. Justine, you want to add to that, or?
The question just disappeared. I wanted to read it.
I'm sorry. I just.
I wouldn't have it in front of me because it was not like it was a complex question.
Let me reread it. I just put it to answer. I didn't realize I was going to take it away from you. Sorry about that.
Oh, you know, if I move to answered, I can see it now. Now I know where to look. How do we attain such meetings when our historical selves are meeting? I think it's funny, the whole thing about self, you know, I think about how you know, there's like the Western, like low context society idea that we're individuals, and then and then in most societies in the world, like we're high context. I am my mother's daughter. I am my grandfather's granddaughter. I introduce myself because I belong to people. And I think that would be a way for our culture to shift, you know, away from individualism, which really is not human, right? It is a way of being human, but it's not sort of the most common practice of humanity. So I think to allow ourselves to be human, because I think that's the thing, we both get trapped. We all get trapped in these masks of, I could go on. I was thinking about this whole thing about digital blackface, right? And put on a face that is not their own to express a part of themselves that they don't know how to express. And I just feel like it's about Baldwin was so good about writing about taking our masks off. What would it be like to just know ourselves and then be willing to be curious about the other person there. So I just think it's sort of again, this deeply, getting rid of gross narcissism, right? That's where we've got to challenge that and think about the way that narcissism is wrapped up in materialism and the way we make ourselves into commodities, the ways that we were once commodities, the way we commodify our relationships. I just think we can't separate these things from, anyway, I noticed there was another question coming in about class, which I think I could
okay, let's
go ahead.
That one, yeah.
Go ahead and answer that one if you want to go with that one. The question was, class seems to be a strong factor among whites responding to Black Lives Matter. How much, if at all, is class identity affecting Black Lives Matter strategies and conversations among those who identify as Black?
But Jennifer, if you wanted to answer the other one, I wasn't trying to jump.
Oh, no. In regards to the other one, I think when it comes to something like narcissism, we have to acknowledge the ways that by being saying having an identity, like even a white one, there's benefits to that. And so it becomes very difficult for somebody to do that work and disassociate from that because there's benefits to having that identity. So I think, I don't know if we have to, but there has to be a way to sort of poke at these identities and these ways of moving through the world, just getting them from, I don't want to say the word privilege because I think it's overused, but saying, okay, you identify in this way, acknowledging that you identify in this way and what you get out of that. And I guess to piggyback or to push it further into the next question with regards to class, I see a lot of performativity. I guess that's a nice way to say it, in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. And you'll go through like this neighborhood and in Lafayette's not the most liberal place. It's fairly conservative. It's in the South. It's a mid-sized city. But there's pockets because it's a university town of, progressivism. And you'll see like a Black Lives Matter flag but there are events and things that I attend and go to where there will be like 1 or 2 Black people. And you ask yourself, how generative is this space to this belief system if there's only 1 or 2 Black people here and we have a thriving African-American community? So I don't know. I think, when it comes to when I've taught and engaged with these ideas about what Black Lives Matter is and what it's sort of fighting against or discussing, you see the resistance from certain students because they feel threatened by it. Mm-hmm. And I think people feel threatened by this, and part of and what they've articulated is they feel as if Black people are getting special treatment by being significantly targeted by the police or something, mm-hmm. or getting special treatment by having their particular issues being broadcast in a way. And I saw a lot of that around the discussion around Trayvon Martin. Like, why does this matter? Why are we caring about this kid in Florida? Why does, but then you have to explain what Emmett Till is to people. And then you have to explain, Scottsboro Boys and all this other stuff to people. And you have to bring them into this historical context. So honestly, I think a lot of our issues, at least culturally, talking about these things interpersonally and generally in institutions, educationally, I've seen is we just have a really horrible system of teaching history in this country. And I tend to wonder if it's not purposeful, that mm-hmm. people just don't know history.
Yeah, I know.
I wrote this down. I didn't mean to interrupt, but you talked about academia, and there's another question here about academia, and I thought about the executive order that was, of course, just recently signed about history and the teaching of history. So what do you make of that? And I think you're about to answer, Justine. I didn't mean to cut you off, but kind of our education system and what we teach educationally, specifically K-12. Yeah. Because I know in college we work to teach these things, but in K-12, those types of things. Because you actually posted something on Twitter. That was you, I think, right? Yeah. From your students. So what about that?
Yeah, what's funny, I was just going to jump right into the Civil War before you brought that up. Because, well, the movie, The Free State of Jones, I feel like is a difficult watch. It's a violent film, but man, like people need to watch that movie if they want to understand those intersections of class and Black Lives, because it showed how poor white people were exploited, how white supremacy destroyed white communities, and still does. White supremacy still destroys white people, right? And so if they could watch that and be like, I don't want to be a pawn in the big man's game, you know what I mean? Because that movie showed how one county in Mississippi stood strong against the Confederacy, and also how white Union soldiers couldn't understand how poor white Southern people could actually be in solidarity with poor white Black people, right? And I'm gonna start crying because it's that's when King got killed, when he was
yes.
And to be honest, the fact that I come from poor white people is more shameful than that I come from bougie Black people. You know what I mean? There's a class and race hierarchy that I have to wrestle with internally, and shame around, all those things. And I just think we have to see each other as part of a solution, because we've all been part of a really painful exploitation and violent
Yes.
takeover by people that want to maintain power,
Yes.
and like, and it doesn't have to be that way. And so, yeah, okay.
Exactly.
No, I mean,
yeah.
that's what Lillian Smith talks about. That's what she gets to, and that's what I just put this in the chat. But I knew this stuff before, but never the extent. Carrie Lee Merritt's Masterless Men,
Mhm.
which talks about that during poor whites in the 18 antebellum period and how they were suppressed, and the Jim Crow laws are basically on them, and then Jim Crow laws moved to, of course, after Reconstruction. But the ways that that those in power keep class separate. And I think of Frank Yerby too, and that flattening of whiteness. When you mentioned Cajuns, Jennifer, because I mean, you and I both know Gaines, and that
Yes.
scene, Gathering of All Men, where what's his name? Crap, the football player.
I know.
He's Salt. I know that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But where he comes up to the wealthy white landowner, and he's basically like, you're treating us the same way that you're treating the blacks in the quarters. You see us as no different.
Right.
And in Gaines, you see the way that the white landowners use the Cajuns to enact their will.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, back Miss Jane Pittman, they enlist a Cajun just as a they to kill the black school teacher.
Yeah.
So all those things.
Well, and it's so interesting because I just have the lived experience of going through a hurricane, and my apartment complex is not that nice. So all the siding was on the lawn, right? So, I mean, I'm an instructor, which is a step up above an adjunct. So I'm not rolling in the dough here. And so basically I'm surrounded by, mostly working class people and middle class people who are trying to save some money, that kind of thing. And, we were all outside, some masked, some not, for different reasons, but we were just surveying the damage, and people were just relating and talking and joking and, relating to people of different, I mean, honestly, black and white, because that's mostly what's in my apartment complex. And my sister turned to me and said, these people, we were all helping each other, ruminating over the chintziness of the apartment complex and joking around. But I know we're going to vote differently in this election. I know we have, it's like you can communicate and talk to people and relate to people and share cultural ways of being and even values with people, and yet be so viciously and bitterly divided about grand political things. And it just blows my mind because I see it every day. That divide where, I can talk to you, pass the time with you. And yet when it comes to Black Lives Matter, we're going to fight on Facebook because it's incredible. But I think, piggybacking, going back to what you were saying, Josina, about this idea of like, what our country does to rural or poor white people is something that's really interesting, because there is this sort of like this taste or, or pushing off on certain values and beliefs on certain people. And that way we can, wipe our hands of that. And, and yet those two groups of people, that's juxtaposed against Black people. I don't know how you untangle that, but I do know what's hopeful. There have been moments many times in history that people have pushed against that. There is possibilities for that. As far as it happening, on a mass scale, I don't know. But there's potential for that, and we see that in literature, in history, it actually happening. And Matt and I have talked many times about Gaines's work, and a lot of times it's work, but it turns on these moments of people relating and realizing and coming together and knowing that you're not my enemy, I'm being oppressed and exploited. That's what this is. But it's always on an individual one-to-one level, or maybe even a group level, but it's never on this mass scale. Because as you were saying, when we get close to that, the powers that be, not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but people, people stamp that out, like Bacon's Rebellion, right? So it is, I think that's where I think some of our troubles lie, and that, when we're separated so grandly in that way and not able to see each other, we can't see all the ways in which, we are being exploited. I don't know.
Matthew, do we have time to take this one last question?
Yeah, you can take that last one. Do you want me to read it? Or you can read it.
I can read it. It's from Jamil Zainuldin. It says, do you think that scholars, intellectuals, and university faculty have a particular role or responsibility to play in conversations with the public outside the classroom?
Should I talk? I don't know. I mean, I think yes. I think yes. I spoke earlier about in this moment, people will advance individually and take opportunities because we have this moment where we're trying to do this work. And so someone's going to get that job, someone's going to get that position, someone's going to get an opportunity because people are realizing we need to do something about or anything about the things that are happening in this country. And so somebody's going to get that position at this university and somebody's going to get this job at this company because we're invested in these things. And to make that argument that, okay, to have substantive change, it has to be that it can't just be about personal advancement. It has to be about something bigger than that. Unfortunately, the work that it puts on these individual scholars to do that is unfair, right? That this person, that, you as an individual has to do that. But I do think that it needs to be done. A lot of times at the university, sometimes you're required to do that community work and sometimes you're not. Some people feel it moved to do that work. I think it is necessary to do that work because look what we're having to expose people to, right? Everybody does not have this access. And so I think, a lot of times students will come in my classroom and be like, I didn't know this, I didn't realize this. And I'm like, okay, somebody told me, and it might have been at my undergrad university, but somebody did that. So I have to, I need to do that. If I want to see substantive change, I need to do that work. Unfortunately, sometimes you're on your own and you're one of one in a department or two or three, but I do think it is necessary to do that work. Yeah. What do you think, Josina? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking about my friends in academia who'll text me and be like, oh, they're asking me to sit on this committee and I'm tired. And that's where I'm not quite sure about the root of the question, like whether this person is a faculty in a school trying to figure out what to say yes to. And I guess my advice would be to guard your time and if you're being asked to do something outside your job description, this is where, I put on my capitalist hat and say, go ahead and monetize that. If you're being asked beyond the work that like, if you're a person of color being asked to work more than a white person in your faculty, then that is an injustice, right? That's being perpetuated. And so I'm not in academia, but I got friends who tell me that happens. And so I would say it's a responsibility, again, of everyone, of the whole community of whatever institution to say, how are we caring for our scholars, right? Because burnout is real and or people saying yes to things because they feel like they need to, but not really doing it because it's, like some people are really good researchers. They are really good researchers.
And they should research.
The best article writers, right? Believe me, I'm an editor and I'm like, thank you for your research. But like, what I'm trying to say is like, do the work that you are committed to. And if you were hired to be a researcher, I don't think you should suddenly then feel like you've got to pick up a flag and be at every weekend protest. You know what I mean? Because you will burn out or be at everything. Like, and I think just like, so I guess I would balance what you said with like the sense of discerning and also comparison of like our schools and institutions asking more of people of color right now in ways that are not being then compensated
and to piggyback off that, if you want to see certain things happening, do not put it on just the scholars of color, the women scholars or whoever in your department to do that work. Make everyone do it. Don't go to that, everyone should be doing this. It shouldn't just be, this one person who is doing this. Make everyone participate in these things. I completely agree with you about that. And it is unfair that people are asked to do more work than other people, because it's like, okay, I was hired to do this, but then also I'm going to be needed to do this and do this. And I've seen it happen at my particular university, where students of color reach out and you're having to mentor and do certain things with them that they're not getting, in their other classes and with other instructors. And that's what it just like comes with that. And it's unfair. Yeah. So, and that's part of it. That's just like part of the territory. And like when you're in it, you're like, okay, I guess this is what it is. And it's just patently unfair. Absolutely.
And I guess the one other thing I would add to kind of reverse what I just said is how amazing it is, like when I read about in the 1960s civil rights movement, like the fact that people had like these full-time jobs as teachers, and then like, Mississippi organizers, they were meeting every night. They worked full-time, they got together, they planned, they organized, they had trainings. They were like doing so much outside of the classroom. And I'm talking about elementary and middle school and high school. But I guess I'm just saying, like, movements are built by people working outside of their job description, right? And doing what they do in their spare time. And I think that we really have been hypnotized by our little, by these things, and by, are we engaging with these things as tools for real engagement?
That is a whole conversation.
Or are we hypnotizing ourselves and like just trying to check out and be like, whew, I'm off the clock? And is that part of why we're so alienated and so far from where we want to be as a society, because we're not actually, and again, like COVID, we can't actually be hitting at physical meetings.
Yeah.
Power.
But we got to wrap it up, but there's a lot more we could say, and please join online at Untangling Whiteness #. But the last thing I want to wrap up with is, I've seen with history a lot of historians using those tools you're talking about, Jacina, and using them in that, speaking publicly, about these things. And one of the things is I wish literary scholars, we would start doing that more. That's a personal thing for me, but thank you both very much. And like I said, please continue the conversation on Twitter, and we'll come back in about a 5-minute break. I think with Dr. Watson and Andrew Iden.